I am Marco Navarro, 34 years old, a mechanic, and the owner of a small garage on the outskirts of Flagstaff, Arizona. Out here, red desert roads stretch beneath the shadow of the San Francisco peaks. The air is sharp with pine and the dry chill of the high plateau. My days are simple, filled with the clatter of wrenches, the smell of oil, and quiet evenings with a black coffee in my small rented house. But this story isn't about my life now. It's about who I was 7 years ago, when everything in my life shifted in ways I never could have imagined. I grew up in a Mexican-American family where duty was praised, though not always practiced. My father, Mateo, ran a civil construction company inherited from his father, Julio. My mother, Adriana, was a homemaker, but she handled every penny with a sharp, calculating mind. They lived in Scottsdale, surrounded by golf courses, swimming pools, and sprawling mansions. I never belonged there. While they wanted me to study business and take over the company, I wanted to fix things: bicycles, trucks, anything with gears. I wanted to build a life with my own hands. That independence made me a disappointment in their eyes. I left home after high school, took a technical course at community college, and moved to Flagstaff. I built a quiet life there, rarely visiting Scottsdale because every visit meant enduring their cold, judging stares. The only person who made me feel seen was my grandmother, Beatrice, who lived with them out of tradition. She was small, with snow-white hair and gentle eyes, and she always drew me to the backyard where her garden bloomed. "You're like your grandfather," she would say, "a man who did things on his own without waiting for handouts." But beneath the surface, tension simmered. My parents wanted control of her estate, the land in Mexico, the company shares, and even the grand Scottsdale house that she alone held after my grandfather's passing. They hinted often at dividing the assets fairly, but my grandmother always smiled without answering. I never cared about wealth. All I wanted was a sense of belonging. One autumn afternoon, when I was 27, my mother called. Her voice was gentle but urgent. She asked me to come home for a family discussion. I arrived at the Spanish-style villa in Scottsdale, feeling like a stranger as always. My father greeted me with only a nod, my mother with a forced smile. My grandmother hugged me tightly at the door, her eyes betraying sadness. She didn't speak aloud. They sat me down in the living room and spoke about arrangements for my grandmother's future. They said she wasn't young anymore, and her estate needed to be put in order. I looked at her, hands trembling in her lap, and I knew something was deeply wrong. That night, she admitted quietly that she felt uneasy but asked me not to worry. I returned to Flagstaff with a heavy heart, sensing that I had stepped into a game I did not yet understand. Weeks later, my mother called again. She asked me to escort my grandmother to the Navarro family reunion in Mexico, a tradition held every 3 years. Normally my parents attended, but this time they claimed to be too busy. Reluctantly, I agreed. My grandmother seemed so eager to go, and I thought maybe the trip would lift her spirits. We set out early one morning in my old Ford F-150, carrying her small suitcase, a bag of tamales, and an old photo of my grandfather she cherished. My parents watched from the doorway, their faces void of warmth, and I felt unease tighten around me. On the drive south, my grandmother told me stories of my grandfather, of their early years in Mexico, and of how he believed love mattered more than money. But her voice turned heavier as she admitted feeling tired, not just from age, but in her heart. She wouldn't say more, only that she was glad to be with me. As night fell and we wound through mountain roads near the border, the truck jolted violently. A tire had blown out while I replaced it under dim light. My grandmother suddenly called me to the passenger side. She had found a plastic bag hidden under the seat, heavy with a white powder I instantly recognized as drugs, nearly 10 pounds of it. My blood ran cold. I had no idea how it got there, but I knew one thing: it wasn't an accident. My grandmother's hands shook as she whispered that she feared my parents had planned this, that they wanted to stop her from going to Mexico, and perhaps even to frame me. I called my parents in panic, demanding answers. They denied everything, their voices eerily calm, insisting it must be a mistake. But I heard rehearsed tones and hollow reassurances. The truth was becoming clearer and far more terrifying than I ever imagined. I stared at the bag of drugs in my hands, the mountain air biting against my skin, though the chill came more from inside me. My grandmother's whisper echoed in my head. Not an accident. The weight of those words was heavier than the bag itself. If the police stopped us at the border, we would both be destroyed. I thought of the calm denial in my father's voice, the strange urgency in my mother's tone. It was as if the trap had been waiting all along, and I had walked right into it. I shoved the bag into my jacket and finished changing the tire, trying to appear calm for my grandmother's sake. She sat in the truck clutching her sweater, her eyes wide with worry. When I returned to the driver's seat, she told me she had overheard my parents arguing in recent weeks. They spoke about the estate, about her refusing to sign papers, about finding another way if she did not comply. Her voice trembled when she said she feared they were targeting both of us. I gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I thought about dumping the bag right there, but I knew if I did, I'd lose the only proof tying this scheme to my parents, yet carrying it meant risking everything. It was a cruel choice, and I didn't know which was worse. We kept driving, and I promised her I'd protect her no matter what. When we reached a small border town, I decided on a plan. I would put my grandmother safely on a bus to the family reunion, while I went back to Scottsdale to confront the truth. She resisted, saying it was too dangerous, but I insisted. She finally agreed, though her eyes held both fear and pride as she squeezed my hand. "Be careful." "Marco," she whispered, "I don't want to lose you." I put her on a bus bound for Sonora, hugging her tightly before watching her vanish into the night. Then I turned the truck north, the bag hidden in the toolbox behind me, my mind spiraling with rage and confusion on the long drive. I called Javier, an old friend who worked with the Flagstaff police. Without explaining too much, I asked him what would happen if someone was caught with drugs at the border. His tone was grave. "You'd be facing years in prison, Marco, and without proof, no one would believe it wasn't yours." His words sank like stones into my chest. It was near midnight when I arrived in Scottsdale. I parked the truck a few streets away and crept toward my parents' villa, phone in hand, set to record. I crouched by the backyard window, close enough to hear their voices. My mother sounded shaken, her words sharp and fearful. "Marco found the bag. If he realizes it wasn't an accident, we'll lose everything." My father's reply was cold, confident. "Calm down. He has no proof. He's just a dumb mechanic. But if Mom still refuses to sign, we'll find another way. People will believe an old woman died of a heart attack." My blood turned to ice. They weren't just trying to frame me. They were ready to kill my grandmother. I pressed record harder against the glass, every muscle in my body trembling with fury. I knocked on the door. When my mother opened it, her eyes widened in shock, but she quickly masked it with feigned calm. My father appeared behind her, whiskey glass in hand, gaze sharp as knives. I walked straight in, my voice steady but cutting. "I found the bag in my truck, 10 pounds of drugs hidden under the seat. Do you know anything about it?" My mother gasped, then tried to dismiss it as a customer's mistake. My father accused me of being careless. I laughed bitterly, then told them I'd overheard everything. Their denials cracked, and my mother snapped, confessing that the company was failing, that they had no choice but to force my grandmother's hand. My father tried to silence her, but I held up my phone. The recording was running. Her words were already captured. He lunged at me, grabbing my collar, snarling that I was nothing, a failure, unworthy of the Navarro name. I shoved him off, my rage boiling. "Family. You destroyed it long ago. I'm not your son anymore." I stormed out, my phone clutched in my hand like a lifeline. I drove through the desert night, my chest burning with pain, but also with a grim sense of clarity. I sent the recording to Javier through a secure app. "Keep it safe," I wrote. He replied instantly, warning me to be careful, but I didn't answer. All I could think of was my grandmother, waiting in Sonora, never realizing just how close she had come to losing her life. I had proof now, but proof meant nothing if I couldn't keep her safe. As dawn broke, I crossed into Mexico. The village roads coated in red dust and the sound of mariachi music rising in the distance. Families were gathering for the reunion, laughter and food filling the air. But I walked past it all with only one goal: to find my grandmother and tell her the truth. I found my grandmother sitting quietly in the corner of the reunion yard, a green dress draped around her thin frame, her silver hair catching the morning light. She was staring off into the distance, but when she saw me, her eyes lit up and she gripped my hand as if she feared I might vanish again. She scolded me gently for disappearing, but her worry melted into relief when I told her I was back for her. I couldn't hide the truth. I told her what I had overheard in Scottsdale, how my parents had spoken about the bag of drugs and their plan to harm her if she refused to sign away the estate. Tears welled in her eyes, though they carried no surprise. Only sorrow. "I feared as much," she whispered, "but I prayed it wasn't true. To know my son could think of such things." Her voice cracked, and I felt my chest ache as I held her trembling hands. I showed her my phone and told her I had captured proof. She pressed my hand tightly, her eyes searching mine. "You've already sacrificed so much. Marco, you shouldn't have to carry this burden." But I shook my head. "I'm not doing it for the estate. I'm doing it for you. You're the only one who has ever truly cared for me." That night, instead of dwelling in sorrow, she pulled me toward the long tables covered in tamales, tacos, and bowls of salsa. Laughter and music filled the air, and she insisted I eat, talk, and join the family. At first I resisted, weighed down by anger, but her determination melted my defenses. Soon, uncles and aunts were hugging me, cousins laughing at my clumsy dancing, and my grandmother beamed as if her heart had grown lighter with every smile I managed. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged. When the music slowed, I took her hand and guided her onto the dance floor. She protested that she was too old, but her laughter rang out as we swayed gently to the rhythm of guitars. Her silver hair shimmered under lantern light, her smile radiant. For a moment, all the darkness of Scottsdale faded away. There were no drugs, no threats, no schemes, only the two of us, standing together as family should. The reunion stretched deep into the night. Later, sitting on a wooden bench, we shared churros dusted with cinnamon. She placed her hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Marco, you've given me more joy today than I've felt in years. Promise me one thing. Don't let their greed weigh down your heart. Live in kindness, not anger." I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded, though I wasn't sure how to let go of the fury burning inside me. When the reunion ended days later, I told her I wanted her to come live with me in Flagstaff. My house was small, nothing like the grand Scottsdale villa, but it would be hers as much as mine. She looked at me with eyes shining through tears and said softly, "I'll go with you. Not because I fear them, but because you are my home." I hugged her, my heart swelling with both sadness and hope. But before we could move forward, we had to return to Scottsdale for her belongings. The drive back was quiet, her hand resting in mine. She looked determined, no longer weighed down by fear. When we arrived, she insisted on walking with me to the front door. My mother's face went pale when she opened it, my father scowling behind her. "We're here for Grandma's things," I said coldly. "She's not staying here anymore." My grandmother stepped forward, her voice sharp as a blade. "Mateo, Adriana, I thought you needed me, but you only needed my money. Marco is the only one who truly cares for me, and I will live with him." Verhul. The silence in that room was suffocating. My father tried to argue that the estate belonged to the family, but my grandmother silenced him with a glare fiercer than I had ever seen. "Family is not measured in money, and you two lost the right to call yourselves mine when you plotted against me." I led her upstairs, helped her pack her clothes and keepsakes, including the photo of my grandfather, as we left. I turned and looked at them one last time. "Don't try to contact us. If you do, I'll take the recording straight to court." Their faces twisted with resentment, but they said nothing more. That evening, as the sun set behind us and the desert stretched wide and endless, my grandmother leaned against me in the truck, holding the photograph of her late husband. "Marco," she said softly, her eyes shimmering, "thank you. I've never felt this free." I drove north toward Flagstaff, the sky burning red, knowing that a new chapter of our lives had just begun. When we arrived in Flagstaff, my small wooden house became something new. My grandmother wasted no time turning it into a home. She planted roses, cacti, and wildflowers in the front yard. Humming old Mexican songs as she watered them each morning, she brought life to every corner. From the kitchen, where tamales simmered on the stove, to the garden bench where we shared quiet conversations at dusk. For the first time since leaving Scottsdale years earlier, I felt the warmth of a real family under my roof. I worked long days at the garage, but evenings were reserved for her. She would tell me stories of my grandfather's stubbornness, his humor, and his deep love for family. Her resilience inspired me, and I began to realize that wealth wasn't measured in money, but in the people who stood by us. Still, I couldn't completely bury what had happened in Scottsdale. The recording sat locked away with Javier, who promised to keep it safe. I also met with a lawyer, Mr. Garcia, who warned me that my parents might try again. "This recording is strong enough to press charges if needed," he said, "but protect your grandmother above all else." 4 years passed quickly. My grandmother remained strong, though I began to notice her energy fading. She no longer spent long mornings in the garden. Her steps slowed, her naps grew longer, and I could see time pressing down on her fragile frame. One winter evening, as we sat over tamales she had carefully prepared, she took my hand and smiled. "Marco, I know my time is not long, but I am happy. These years with you have been the best of my life." I wanted to protest, to insist she had many years left, but she only shook her head gently. That night, she passed away peacefully in her sleep, in my arms. I held her close, tears soaking her silver hair, feeling like I had lost not just a grandmother, but the only true parent I had ever known. A week later, I met with Mr. Garcia, who handed me her will. My heart pounded as I read it. She had left everything to me: the Scottsdale house, the land in Mexico, shares in the construction company, and a significant savings account. She had drawn the will years earlier, witnessed and notarized, ensuring it would hold in court. She wanted to make sure you were cared for. "Marco," Mr. Garcia said softly, "she trusted you to protect her legacy." I sat there in silence, the papers heavy in my hands. I hadn't wanted her wealth. I only wanted her presence, her laughter, her stories. But this was her final gift, her way of shielding me even after death. It didn't take long for my parents to appear. They showed up at my doorstep in Flagstaff, faces hard and desperate. My mother's voice was sharp with rage. "This estate belongs to the family. You have no right to keep it all." My father glared, his jaw tight, his eyes full of the same cold calculation I had known since childhood. I stood firm, my voice like steel. "She made her choice, and you know why? If you want to fight, go ahead. I have the recording." Their faces paled at my words. They said nothing more and left, vanishing from my life as though I had never been their son. I later heard their company collapsed into bankruptcy, and they moved to California. I never looked them up. I had no desire to know what became of them. The Scottsdale house I sold, using the money to expand my garage and to support a local community center. The land in Mexico I kept, not as an asset but as a memory of my grandparents, who had built everything from nothing. My life remained simple, but I felt at peace. 3 years after her passing, I renamed my garage with a wooden sign out front: Beatrice's Corner. I added a small cafe inside where customers could drink coffee while waiting for their cars, every morning when I unlocked the door. I touched the sign and felt her presence lingering, her spirit watching over me. Her garden bloomed each season, roses and cacti vibrant as though she were still tending them. Javier sometimes asked what I wanted to do with the recording. "Keep it," I always said. "If they return, we'll need it." But I hope that day never comes. I no longer lived in fear. My grandmother had taught me that peace came not from clinging to anger, but from choosing kindness, even when betrayal burned deep. One summer afternoon, I sat on the bench in the garden, holding the old photograph of my grandfather beside his vintage truck, smiling with pride. I wondered if he would have approved of me a mechanic with oil-stained hands, not a businessman like his son. But I knew he would see that I had kept my promise to protect the woman he loved, giving her final years filled with laughter, safety, and dignity. That mattered more than any fortune or company ever could. The years that followed were quiet yet fulfilling. My garage grew from a one-man shop into a small business with 3 employees who became more like family than colleagues. The little cafe corner I built became a favorite spot for locals, where regulars stopped in for coffee and conversation while their cars were serviced. On the wooden sign above the entrance, my grandmother's name stood proud: Beatrice's Corner. Every time I walked under it, I felt as though she was still there, watching over me. Life in Flagstaff was modest, but rich in ways Scottsdale could never offer. The mountains framed my mornings, the pine-scented wind carried memories of my grandmother's songs, and the garden outside bloomed with roses she had planted. I watered them daily, each drop like a whispered promise that I would never forget her lessons. I rarely thought of my parents. They had disappeared completely from my life, their voices and faces fading into the past like ghosts I no longer wished to confront. Rumors reached me through distant relatives that their company had gone bankrupt and they had moved to California. I felt neither satisfaction nor hatred. I simply let it go. My grandmother had once told me not to let anger control my heart, and I tried to honor her wisdom. Still, Javier kept the recording locked safely away. Sometimes he would ask if I wanted him to destroy it. Each time, I shook my head. Keep it. If they ever try to come back, it's all we have, deep down. I doubted they would return. Greed had driven them to destroy their own family, and now they had nothing left to claim. It wasn't the estate that changed my life, but the responsibility that came with it. I donated part of the money from the Scottsdale house to a community center for young mechanics and students who needed guidance. I saw myself in them, young men and women who didn't fit into their families' expectations, searching for a place to belong. Whenever I taught them how to replace a transmission or rebuild an engine, I remembered how my grandmother had encouraged me to embrace what I loved, even when others called it a failure. As the seasons turned, I carried her memory into every part of my daily life. On winter evenings, I would make tamales using her old recipe, sometimes failing miserably, other times almost getting it right. On summer mornings, I'd sit on the bench she loved and watch the sunrise, hearing her voice reminding me that joy can be found even in simple moments. 4 years after her passing, I realized that grief had softened into something else. It was no longer a sharp wound, but a steady presence, a reminder that love leaves traces long after a person is gone. I learned to live with it, even to cherish it. One particular afternoon, as golden light filtered through the garden, I opened her old notebook where she had written recipes, stories, and fragments of memories. On the last page, in her shaky handwriting, were words that felt meant for me. Family is not in blood, but in those who choose to love us. Protect them, and you will never be alone. I closed the notebook with tears in my eyes, realizing she had prepared me for this life even after she was gone. There were times I wondered if I should have done more with the estate. I could have tried to revive the construction company or invested in Scottsdale's world of wealth. But each time the thought crossed my mind, I reminded myself of who I was: a mechanic, a man who found peace in honest work, in oil-stained hands, and in the laughter of customers who trusted me. That was enough. Sometimes customers would ask about the cafe's name, and I would smile, telling them it was for my grandmother. I'd share a piece of her story, how she had raised me not with money, but with love and courage. People often paused, touched by her memory, and I knew that in small ways her spirit continued to touch lives through me. I never heard from my parents again. Perhaps they couldn't face the shame of their downfall, or perhaps they were simply gone from this world. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. All I carried forward was the lesson my grandmother left me, that greed blinds, but love heals. 7 years have passed since the night I discovered the drugs hidden in my truck. 7 years since I walked away from a house filled with betrayal and chose instead to build a life of my own. Looking back, I see now that the greatest gift my grandmother gave me wasn't the estate or the inheritance. It was the belief that I was enough just as I was, and that family is defined by the people who choose to stand beside us when the world turns cold. 7 years later, I sit in the same small house in Flagstaff, sunlight streaming through the windows, catching dust motes that sparkle like tiny stars. My garage is steady now, with 3 employees I trust and a corner cafe that welcomes neighbors each morning. Above the door hangs the wooden sign, Beatrice's Corner, the letters worn smooth by sun and time. Every day I touch it, and every day it reminds me that love outlives betrayal. In the garden, her roses still bloom. Each red petal is like her smile, gentle and steady, even in memory. I water them as she once did, each drop carrying with it a whisper of gratitude. Sometimes I talk to her aloud, telling her about the customers, the business, or the laughter of children who come to the cafe for sweet bread. And in those quiet moments, I almost feel her sitting beside me on the bench, humming the same old songs. I think often of my grandfather, too. I keep the photograph of him beside his vintage truck on my workbench in the garage. His grin is wide, his posture proud, and though I never knew him well, I like to believe he would be proud of me, not for wealth, not for success, but for keeping my promise to my grandmother, for giving her peace in her final years when her own son turned against her. The estate she left me remains a tool, not a treasure. I used it to expand the garage, to help others, and to honor her memory. I never chased the luxury of Scottsdale, because I know now it was an illusion. Houses can be grand, fortunes can be vast, but without love they are empty. What endures are the choices we make to protect those who truly matter. I no longer carry hate for my parents. For a long time, anger burned in me like fire, threatening to consume every thought. But my grandmother's words stayed with me. If we let pain rule us, we miss the beautiful moments, so I let them go. They chose greed, and I chose peace. Perhaps they live somewhere far away now, but their chapter in my life has closed. I don't wish them harm, nor do I wish for reconciliation. I simply wish for nothing at all, and in that emptiness, I've found freedom. Javier still keeps the recording, locked in his safe. Sometimes he asks if I want him to destroy it. I always shake my head. Keep it. If they ever return, we'll be ready. But in truth, I hope that day never comes. I don't want my life defined by evidence of betrayal. I want it defined by the roses in the garden, the laughter in the cafe, and the peace of a man who chose honesty when the world tried to force him into corruption. On quiet evenings, I write in an old leather notebook, just as I am now, recording the story of those years so that if I ever have children, they will know the truth. Not the scandal, not the wealth, but the lesson that family is not bound by blood, but by love and protection. That greed may bring riches, but robs the soul of what truly matters: trust, compassion, and the bond between people who choose each other. Sometimes, I imagine what my grandmother would say if she could sit beside me again. I think she would smile, touch my cheek the way she used to, and remind me that I don't need to prove myself to anyone. Just being true to who I am is enough, and for the first time in my life, I believe it. So this is my story, a story not of riches or power, but of love, betrayal, and the strength to choose a different path. I chose my grandmother. I chose honesty over greed, compassion over hatred, and though the road was filled with pain, it led me here, to a life of peace. And that, more than anything, is the legacy she left me. If you've made it this far, I ask you to carry this lesson with you. Family is not given, it is built. It is built in every choice to stand by someone, even when it costs you everything. And it is in those choices that we find the kind of wealth no fortune can ever buy. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear how you define family in your own life. Together, we can keep stories like this alive.